This video is focused on solving absolute value equations, but before we can do that, we need to talk about what an absolute value is. So you might have seen something like this. A vertical bar with a number inside. Now, how does it work? Well, this is called the absolute value of -3. So I'm going to write that down. Absolute value of -3. I know it's an absolute value because I see these vertical bars around the -3. And the way it works is absolute values are supposed to like spit out the positive version of any number. So the absolute value of -3 is just 3. The absolute value of -11, that's just 11. So absolute values, they take a number that's negative and they spit out the positive number. Now, what if you put a positive number inside of an absolute value? So what if I did absolute value of 5? Then what comes out is just 5. So it basically takes any number and then out comes the positive version of the number. So take a second to think about what absolute value of 7 is. Yes, it's 7. What do you guys think absolute value of -1.2 is? It is, in fact, positive 1.2. So it spits out positive numbers. Okay, so how do we talk about absolute value equations? Well, an absolute value equation is any equation that has absolute values in it. So it could be something like 3 times absolute value of x minus 2 plus 7 equals absolute value of x. So an absolute value equation is an equation with absolute values in it. And that's an absolute value equation. So let's take a look at a rather simple absolute value equation and talk about what its solutions are. In other words, like what x's satisfy it. So consider this equation. Absolute value of x is equal to 11. Now I want you to take a second and think about what x could I put in here? So like what could the number in here for x be to get an 11 out? So what x's satisfy this? Now, if you're thinking x could be 11, you're correct. Let's check. If I do absolute value of 11, that does equal 11. Is there another one? Yes. If I do x is equal to -11, we get absolute value of -11 equals 11. So there are essentially like two x's that satisfy that equation. Those are the solutions to the absolute value equation. So our solutions are x equals 11 and x equals -11. And so these are like the two things we could put in for x to get 11 out. Okay, this brings us to our first example that's similar to what you'll see on your homework set. So if I consider the equation x, actually let's do 5 minus x inside absolute values equals 2. We're going to think about what are all the solutions to this. So find all solutions to this equation. Okay, now let's think about this. We want to have absolute value of 5 minus x equals 2. Now, what would make this true? In other words, like what x's could we plug in here to make this a true statement? Well, what we need, based on what we know so far, is we need the thing inside. We need it either to be 2 or to be -2. And those are like the only two things that will make us get a 2 out if I take its absolute value. So what I mean by that is we need this to be either equal to 2 or equal to -2. In other words, we need to have 5 minus x equals 2, or we need to have 5 minus x equals -2. The thing inside the absolute value has to be 2 or -2, so that when you take its absolute value, you get a 2 out. we actually have two equations that we can now solve. So we can think, okay, well, either 5 minus x is 2, in which case we have negative x equals 2 minus 5. That's what I get if I subtract 5 from both sides of this. Or negative x is equal to negative 3. And if we multiply both sides of this by negative 1, so I do times negative 1 here and times negative 1 here, we get positive x on the left is equal to 3. Now let's check on the right. So let's take a look over here. 5 minus x equals negative 2. If I subtract 5 from both sides, kind of like what I did on the other sides, if I do minus 5 and minus 5, I get negative x equals negative 7. And then if I multiply both sides by negative 1, so if I multiply the left by negative 1 and the right times negative 1, what I get is x is equal to positive 7. Now this gives us two numbers for x that should satisfy the equation that we're looking at. So this gives us two solutions, x equals 3 and x equals 7. So we have two solutions, x equals 3 or 7. I'm going to separate them by commas. We can actually check our answers. So let's double check and make sure that these are correct. How do we check? We check by plugging in original equation. So I'm abbreviating that so I can fit it in there. So if I take absolute value of 5 minus x equals 2, and if I plug in x equals 3, let's see what happens. I get 5 minus 3 with an absolute value around it, which gives us absolute value of 2. And we do know that absolute value of 2 is 2, so we get both sides are equal to each other. We can do the same thing for 7. So if I plug in x equals 7, I get 5 minus x, absolute value equals 2. What happens if I plug in 7? I get 5 minus 7 is negative 2. In other words, absolute value of negative 2 is 2, and that is in fact equal to 2. So you can see that if you plug in our two solutions, x equals 3 and x equals 7, you do in fact get both sides of the equation are equal. Okay, let's look at another example. Okay, so let's take a look at this one. What are all the solutions to? So find all solutions to absolute value of y minus 11 equals negative 24. Can we approach this equation in the same way that we did the last one? In other words, can I say, okay, the only way to get negative 24 out is if y minus 11 is negative 24 or y minus 11 is positive 24. What do you think? The answer is no. It doesn't make sense. And here's why. When you take an absolute value of something, do you ever get a negative? So like, do we ever get a negative out when you take an absolute value? The answer is no. We never get negatives out. So when you do the absolute value of something, you always get that it's equal to a positive. It's impossible to get a minus sign here. Absolute value of a thing is always a positive. We're never going to get a negative number when we take absolute value. Absolute value spit out positives. So this thing right here, there's like, it can't ever be true. This is going to have no solutions. No solutions at all. It can't ever be true. And that's because absolute values never give you negatives. Okay, so you have to actually think kind of hard to do these ones. Now, what's your general approach? Well, if you have absolute value of something, so if you have like absolute value of blah, 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 blah equals a positive something, positive number, you can solve it by taking the thing on the inside, so this thing here, and you can set it equal to the positive version of the number and then also the negative version of the number. So what you would do is you would set the squiggly guy equal to plus the number, or the squiggly guy equal to minus the number. But if you ever have a scenario where it's like something equals to negative a number, so you have something like something inside an absolute value equals minus a number, then you're automatically going to know no solutions. Because it's impossible to take the absolute value of something and spit out a minus.